the 17th of January, 1940. Krakow, Poland. Morning frost. The cobblestones of the old town square gleamed under a thin veil of ice. Breath hung in the air like frozen prayers. The city had been occupied for 4 months now, and the rhythm of daily terror had become routine. Wehrmacht patrols moved through the streets with mechanical precision, their boots cracking against the cold stone in a rhythm that echoed off buildings older than nations. In a narrow cafe on Florianska Street, a young Polish resistance operative named Jan Kowalski sat hunched over a cup of ersatz coffee, his fingers wrapped around the ceramic for warmth. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He was thinking about survival, about the message folded in his coat pocket, about the 17 names written in invisible ink on tissue paper thin enough to swallow if necessary. The door burst open. 3 Gestapo officers, their leather coats dark as oil slicks, their faces carved from winter itself. They didn't need to announce themselves. Terror announced them. Jan's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, but stopped. Too late. Too obvious. One of the officers pointed directly at him, and in that moment, Jan Kowalski did something the Germans would later struggle to explain in their reports. He smiled, not a nervous grin or a desperate attempt at innocence. A genuine, quiet smile that seemed to carry a secret the entire Third Reich couldn't extract. They dragged him out into the square. Witnesses would later testify that he walked calmly, almost serenely, as if he were being escorted to a dinner party rather than an interrogation cell. And then, in the 30 seconds between the cafe door and the waiting car, 17 things happened that would ripple through the Polish underground for the remainder of the war. But to understand those 30 seconds, we must first understand what brought Jan Kowalski to that moment, and why the smile of a doomed man would become more dangerous to the Nazi occupation than 1,000 rifles. Poland in early 1940 existed in a state of suspended disbelief. The September campaign of 1939 had lasted barely 5 weeks before the combined hammer of German blitzkrieg and Soviet invasion crushed the Polish military. But the speed of military defeat had done something the occupiers hadn't anticipated. It had prevented the complete destruction of Poland's intellectual and organizational infrastructure. Universities had been shuttered, yes. Government officials executed or fled, certainly. But the networks remained. The cafes where professors once debated philosophy became dead drops. The churches where families prayed became communication hubs. The very fabric of Polish civil society, which the Nazis assumed they had torn apart, had simply gone underground. Jan Kowalski was 23 years old, a former engineering student at Jagiellonian University. Before the war, he had been unremarkable, middle-class family, average grades, a fondness for cycling and chess, the kind of young man who would have become a competent engineer, married, raised children, and lived a quiet life measured in small contentments. The invasion had transformed him, as it had transformed millions, but not in the way the Germans expected. They expected either submission or rage. They got neither. They got something colder and more dangerous. Calculated defiance. The Polish resistance in January 1940 was still in its embryonic stage. The various groups, Związek Walki Zbrojnej, the Polish Socialist Party's combat organization, the peasant battalions, were still learning how to operate in occupied territory. They made mistakes. They lost operatives to Gestapo raids and informant betrayals. But they were learning, and Jan Kowalski had proven to be an exceptionally quick study. His engineering background gave him a systematic mind. His youth gave him the physical capability for courier work, and something else, something the recruitment officers in the resistance noticed. Immediately he possessed an almost uncanny calm under pressure. On January 12, 5 days before his arrest, Jan had been given an assignment, a list of 17 names, not resistance fighters, but sympathizers. Doctors who treated wounded partisans without reporting them, priests who hid fugitives, factory workers who engaged in deliberate sabotage. The Gestapo had been closing in on this network for weeks, and the central command of the resistance needed to warn all 17 individuals simultaneously. If even one warning failed to arrive, the entire network could unravel under interrogation. The tissue paper with the names was encoded, but the locations were scattered across Krakow. Jan would need to visit 17 different contact points in 36 hours, delivering warnings without arousing suspicion, without being followed, without leaving a pattern the Germans could detect. He had completed 14 deliveries by the morning of January 17. 3 remained. The Germans who arrested Jan at the cafe were not random patrol officers. They were Gestapo, and they were specifically looking for him. Later investigation would reveal that an informant, a grocer whose shop Jan had used as a dead drop, had been turned 3 days earlier. The grocer hadn't known Jan's real name, but he'd provided a description detailed enough to be actionable. Young man, thin face, walked with a slight favour of his left leg from a childhood accident, frequented cafes in the old town, always ordered coffee, never tea. The arrest itself was textbook Gestapo procedure. Overwhelming force, public humiliation, immediate transportation to avoid crowd formation or rescue attempts. What wasn't textbook was Jan's reaction. Gestapo officers were trained to read fear. Fear was currency in occupied territory. It told them who was guilty, who was hiding something, who would break under pressure. Jan Kowalski showed them none. And that smile, that inexplicable smile, unnerved them in ways their training hadn't prepared them for. SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Richter was supervising interrogations at the Gestapo headquarters on Pomorska Street that morning. He was 38 years old, a career policeman from Munich who had joined the SS in 1933, motivated less by ideological fervour than by career opportunism. The Nazi rise to power had been good for men like Richter, mediocre detectives who found their limitations dissolved in a system that valued brutality over brilliance. He had been in Krakow since October 1939, and he had developed a reputation for efficiency, not cruelty, particularly, though cruelty was certainly a tool he employed. Efficiency. Resistance members brought to Pomorska Street left in one of two conditions: cooperative or dead. There was no third category in Richter's system. When Jan Kowalski was brought into the building, Richter was drinking coffee, real coffee, not the barley substitute the Poles endured, and reviewing reports from the previous night's raids. He glanced up as the prisoner was marched past his office door. The smile caught his attention. Richter had seen every variety of human expression in this building. Defiance that masked terror, false bravado, religious resignation, genuine insanity. But this was different. This young man looked at the walls of the Gestapo headquarters the way someone might look at a museum exhibit, with interest, but without personal stakes. Richter made a note to observe the interrogation personally. The interrogation rooms at Pomorska Street were designed for psychological impact before any physical torture began. Bare concrete walls, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, a metal chair bolted to the floor, the temperature kept deliberately cold. The rooms smelled of disinfectant and old blood, a combination that triggered primal fear responses in most prisoners. Jan was placed in room 7, his hands cuffed behind the chair, and left alone for 30 minutes. Standard procedure. Let them imagine what's coming. Let isolation do the preliminary work. When Richter entered the room, accompanied by 2 subordinates, Jan Kowalski looked up with that same calm expression. No smile now, but no fear either. Just attention. "You know why you're here," Richter said in German. A statement, not a question. Jan responded in Polish. "I was having coffee." "You speak German," Richter said. The informant's report had mentioned this. "This will go easier in German." "Many things would go easier in German," Jan replied, still in Polish. "Poland is not one of them." One of the subordinates moved forward, fist raised, but Richter waved him back. This was interesting. The prisoner was establishing parameters, choosing his language, his stance. Small resistances, but revealing. This wasn't a man in shock. This was a man who had prepared for this moment. The interrogation followed established patterns. Questions about Jan's activities, his associates, the purpose of his movements around Krakow, Jan provided answers that were technically truthful but operationally useless. Yes, he had been moving around the city. He was looking for work. Yes, he had been meeting people. Poland was occupied. Everyone was trying to find ways to survive. No, he had no connection to resistance activities. He was an engineering student, not a soldier. 20 minutes into the interrogation, Richter changed tactics. He produced a photograph. The grocer who had informed on Jan, bound and bloodied in this very building. Your friend was very helpful, Richter said. He described you perfectly. He told us about the messages you carried. Jan looked at the photograph for a long moment. When he looked up, the smile had returned. That man is no friend of mine, he said. I don't know why you've hurt him. The denial was expected. What wasn't expected was the smile. Richter felt something cold move through him. Not fear, he was too insulated by power and position for that, but unease. This young man was not behaving according to the psychological profiles the Gestapo used. He should be desperate. He should be calculating angles of survival. Instead, he seemed almost at peace. We can do this the easy way, Richter said, employing the classic false choice. Or we can do this the other way. You will tell us what we need to know. The only question is how much you suffer first. Jan leaned forward slightly, as much as the restraints allowed. Sturmbannführer, he said, using Richter's rank precisely, speaking now in perfect German. I think there's something you haven't understood about Poland. We already know how this ends. All of it. Your Reich, your occupation, your 1,000 years. We've seen empires before. They all think they're permanent. They're all wrong. It was the longest statement Jan had made since his arrest. And it changed everything in the room. Because it wasn't defiance in the traditional sense. Defiance implies opposition between forces that might be equal. This was something else. This was pity. The first blow came at 10:47 a.m. The subordinate's fist connected with Jan's face, snapping his head to the side. Blood from his lips spattered on the concrete floor. The second blow followed immediately, a strike to the ribs. Then a third. The beating lasted 4 minutes, methodical and professional, designed to inflict pain without causing unconsciousness or death. When it stopped, Jan's face was swelling, his breathing ragged. But when Richter asked the questions again, names, locations, contacts, Jan's answer was the same. Silence, punctuated by that quiet smile. They broke 2 of his fingers at 11:15. The technique was simple. Place the finger on the edge of the table. Apply pressure with a truncheon until the bone snaps. The sound echoed in the small room like a dry branch breaking. Jan's face went white, his jaw clenched, but he made no sound, no scream, no plea, just controlled breathing through the pain. At 11:30, Richter left the room. This wasn't yielding results, and he had other prisoners to process. But something about Kowalski bothered him. The man was enduring torture with the demeanor of someone serving a sentence he had already accepted, as if the pain was simply a formality to be gotten through. Richter had broken hundreds of people in his career. He understood the mechanics of interrogation. But this felt different. This felt like failure, even as it was happening. Jan was left alone in the room again, his hands, including the 2 broken fingers, still cuffed behind the chair. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot fire radiating up his arm. But through the pain, his mind remained clear. He thought about the 3 remaining warnings. The 3 people he hadn't reached: Dr. Mazur, who ran a clinic near the Vistula, Father Tomasz at St. Mary's Basilica, and Maria Wojcik, a school teacher who used her apartment to shelter Jewish children. The tissue paper with the encoded names was still in his coat pocket. The Gestapo had searched him, but the encoding was sophisticated enough that the paper looked like a shopping list. Mundane items, bread, milk, candles. Without the cipher key, it was meaningless. But Jan knew that under prolonged interrogation, eventually, someone would examine every scrap of paper more carefully. Eventually, a cryptographer would be brought in. Eventually, the code would break. He had hours, perhaps, maybe less. The history of resistance under occupation is often told in grand narratives, major acts of sabotage, assassinations of high-ranking officers, intelligence coups that changed the course of battles. But the reality of resistance, particularly in the early stages of occupation, was far more granular. It was tissue paper and invisible ink. It was memorized addresses and faces never photographed. It was the 100 small decisions that kept networks alive when everything pushed toward their collapse. Jan Kowalski was part of a system that was learning how to survive in real time. The Polish resistance in 1940 was making up doctrine as it went, learning from failures, adapting to Gestapo methods. One adaptation that had emerged in the early months was the concept of operational compression, the idea that if an operative was compromised, they had a small window to salvage what they could before complete breakdown. That window was measured not in days but in minutes. At 12:15 p.m., a guard brought Jan water, not out of mercy, but because keeping prisoners conscious and hydrated prolonged their usefulness. As Jan drank, his mind worked through the problem. The 3 remaining warnings had to be delivered. He couldn't deliver them physically, he would never leave this building alive or free. He couldn't speak them, every word in this place was a potential betrayal. But there were other methods of communication. Methods the Gestapo, with all their sophisticated torture techniques, hadn't fully anticipated. The Polish resistance used a system of coded signals that operated through absence rather than presence. If a courier failed to appear at a scheduled contact point, the absence itself was a message. But this system had limitations. It was slow. It relied on multiple checkpoints, and it assumed a normal operational window of 24 to 48 hours. Jan had been arrested in plain sight in a public square. By now, the resistance would know he was compromised, but they wouldn't know specifically what he'd been carrying or who was at immediate risk, unless Jan could tell them. At 1:30 p.m., Richter returned with 2 other officers. The interrogation resumed, this time with enhanced techniques. A bucket of ice water, controlled asphyxiation, electric shocks applied to sensitive areas. Each method was documented, time-stamped, and executed with the same bureaucratic precision the Nazi regime brought to all its atrocities. And through it all, Jan Kowalski maintained a core of silence around the information that mattered. He gave them his name, they knew it already. He gave them his address, meaningless now. He even gave them 2 names from the resistance network, but both were people he knew had already been evacuated from the city or were operating under such deep cover that the names themselves were false identities. What he didn't give them was the 17. By 3 p.m., Jan had been in Gestapo custody for 5 hours. His face was unrecognizable, swollen and purple. His hands were useless, multiple fingers broken. His breathing suggested cracked ribs. But his mind remained intact, focused on a single problem: how to send a warning from inside this room, through these walls, past these guards, to 3 people scattered across Krakow. The answer, when it came, was so simple it was almost absurd. The rhythm of Nazi occupation was built on visibility, public arrests, public executions, public displays of power designed to cultivate fear through witnessing. The Gestapo operated secret facilities, yes, but they also operated in plain sight because terror requires an audience. When Jan Kowalski was dragged from the cafe that morning, it had been in full view of the old town square. Dozens of people had watched, and dozens of people had known immediately what they were witnessing. Krakow's population in early 1940 was still approximately 250,000, reduced from its pre-war numbers but still substantial. The city functioned under occupation, shops opened, trams ran, people went to work, but beneath the surface of normal life, everyone was part of an information network, whether they acknowledged it or not. A Gestapo arrest in the old town would be discussed in shops by noon. By evening, it would have reached every neighborhood. People would speculate. Who was he? What did he do? Was he resistance? Jan understood this. The Germans, in their eagerness to demonstrate power, had created a communication system they couldn't control. Public acts generated public knowledge, and public knowledge moved through occupied populations like electricity through water. But general knowledge, someone was arrested, wasn't enough. Jan needed specific information to reach specific people, and for that, he needed a signal that could be decoded only by those who knew to look for it. At 4 p.m., during a pause in the interrogation, Jan asked to use the toilet. It was a calculated request. Prisoners who asked for basic dignities were often granted them as a false sign of the interrogator's reasonableness, a psychological technique to create artificial rapport. Richter, exhausted by hours of fruitless questioning, agreed. Jan was uncuffed, his broken hands hanging useless at his sides, and escorted to a toilet at the end of the corridor. The toilet had a window. Small, barred, frosted glass, but a window nonetheless, facing the street. Outside, life continued. A tram passed. Pedestrians hurried in the cold, and Jan Kowalski, bleeding and broken, looked through that window and saw his answer. In his engineering classes before the war, Jan had studied signal theory, how information moves through systems, how messages can be embedded in apparently random noise. The principle was simple. If you know what to look for, patterns emerge from chaos. And the Polish resistance, by necessity, had become expert pattern readers. Jan returned to the interrogation room. Richter resumed questioning, and Jan made a decision that would be analysed and debated by historians of the resistance for decades afterward. He began to speak, not answers to Richter's questions, but something else. A stream of seemingly random words, names of streets, numbers, fragments of prayers, Polish folk songs. It appeared to be a complete mental breakdown, the kind of incoherent babbling that sometimes preceded either useful confession or complete psychological collapse. Richter listened, initially with interest, then with frustration. This wasn't information. This was noise. But he let it continue, hoping that somewhere in the verbal wreckage something useful might emerge. What Richter didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Jan was speaking a code, not a sophisticated cipher, but something more elegant, a locational sequence embedded in apparent madness. Every third street name he mentioned corresponded to one of the 17 contacts. Every number sequence was a timing protocol. The fragments of prayers indicated danger levels, and the folk songs were the masterpiece. Each song was associated in Polish culture with specific regions, specific traditions. To anyone listening who understood the context, the songs were a map. Jan spoke for 17 minutes. When he finished, he slumped in the chair, genuinely exhausted. Richter stood, disgusted. "Take him to the cells," he ordered. "Let him rot until he's ready to speak sense." But Jan Kowalski had already spoken sense. He just hadn't spoken it to the Germans. The Pomorska Street Gestapo headquarters, despite its primary function as an interrogation facility, was not hermetically sealed from the city around it. It employed Polish cleaning staff, Polish maintenance workers, Polish cooks for the canteen. These individuals were vetted, certainly, and lived under constant surveillance. But they were also human beings, living in an occupied city, with families and neighbours and the same survival networks as everyone else. A cleaning woman named Zofia Pasternak had been working at Pomorska Street since November 1939. She was 47 years old, widowed, with 2 adult children who had fled east ahead of the invasion. She had taken the job because employment with the occupation government came with ration privileges and a measure of protection. But Zofia Pasternak was also, though the Germans never suspected, a listener. She cleaned interrogation rooms. She heard things. Screams. Yes, always screams. But also words, confessions, rants, prayers. She had trained herself to remember fragments, not out of any organized resistance affiliation, but out of simple human solidarity. Sometimes she could pass information to prisoners' families, tell them their loved one was alive, or wasn't. Small mercies in unmerciful times. On the afternoon of January 17, Zofia was cleaning the corridor outside room 7 when she heard Jan Kowalski's 17-minute monologue. The door was thick, but not soundproof, She heard the street names, the numbers, the songs, and something clicked in her memory. One of the songs, Pwini Wata, Pwini, was a tune her father had sung when she was a child. He had grown up near the Vistula. The song was specific to that region. And one of the street names Jan had mentioned, Berka Joselevica, was near the river. Zofia didn't understand that she was hearing a code, but she understood that it mattered. That night, after her shift ended, she stopped at a church on her way home, St. Joseph's on Pozelska Street. She lit a candle, as many Poles did in those days, a gesture of prayer and defiance, and she mentioned to the priest, in confession, the strange things she'd heard. The priest, Father Wojciech, a man whose sermons on suffering and endurance had made him popular in occupied Krakow, listened carefully. And then he did something the Gestapo had not anticipated in their strategic planning. He remembered. Father Wojciech was part of a loose network of clergy who served as information relays for the resistance. Not formally recruited, not given training or equipment, simply trusted by virtue of their position and character. When Zofia mentioned the songs and the street names, Father Wojciech recognized the names. Not all of them, but enough. Berka Joselevica Street was where Dr. Mazur's clinic operated, and the song Zofia hummed the melody she half remembered was associated with St. Mary's Basilica in resistance communications. By midnight on January 17, Father Wojciech had passed the information through his own channels. By dawn on January 18, the remaining 3 people on Jan Kowalski's list had received warnings. Dr. Mazur closed his clinic and evacuated to a safe house in the countryside. Father Tomasz destroyed his records and moved to a different parish, and Maria Wojcik packed the Jewish children she'd been hiding into a vegetable cart and transported them to a contact with false papers. All 3 survived the war. Jan Kowalski did not. He died in Pomorska Street on the 22nd of January, 1940, 5 days after his arrest. The official cause, according to Gestapo records, was heart failure during interrogation. The reality, as survivors who worked in the facility later testified, was that he had been beaten to death, slowly and methodically, by interrogators frustrated by their inability to extract useful intelligence. His body was disposed of in a mass grave outside the city. No marker, no ceremony, just another casualty of the occupation. But his 17 minutes of coded speech had accomplished what months of traditional courier work might not have. In a single act of linguistic improvisation, trapped in the heart of the Gestapo's operation, he had delivered 17 warnings that saved 17 networks. The ripple effects extended far beyond those immediate contacts. Dr. Mazur, in his countryside hiding, treated wounded resistance fighters for 3 more years. Father Tomasz, in his new parish, ran an underground printing press that produced false identity documents until liberation. Maria Wojcik's network saved over 40 Jewish children by war's end. Klaus Richter never learned what Jan Kowalski had done in room 7 that afternoon. He processed the death as a failure, another prisoner who died without yielding actionable intelligence, and moved on to other cases. Richter survived the war, was captured by the Soviets in 1945, and died in a labor camp in Siberia in 1949. In the thousands of interrogations he conducted, he never once considered that the apparent madness of a dying prisoner might be the most sophisticated communication he'd ever witnessed. The story of Jan Kowalski's arrest and death remained obscure for decades. It was one of thousands of similar stories, buried in the vast and terrible archive of Nazi occupation. But in the 1,970 seconds, when Polish historians began systematically interviewing resistance survivors, the story emerged. Father Wojciech, in his 80s by then, remembered the cleaning woman who came to confession. Zofia Pasternak's daughter, who had returned to Poland after the war, recalled her mother mentioning the young man who sang songs in the Gestapo building, and members of the networks that Jan had saved those who had lived to see liberation, to see the fall of the Reich, to see Poland emerge battered but unbroken from the war. They remembered the warnings that came from nowhere in January 1940. Slowly, painstakingly, historians pieced together what had happened: the arrest in the cafe, the smile that unnerved the Gestapo, the 17 minutes of coded speech, the cleaning woman, the priest, the salvation of the networks, and, at the center of it all, Jan Kowalski, a 23-year-old engineering student who had understood something fundamental about resistance that the Germans, with all their mechanized efficiency, never grasped. Information is water. It finds channels. It seeps through cracks. You can dam it, divert it, contaminate it. But you cannot stop it. Not completely. Not when the people carrying it believe the message is worth more than their lives. The frozen square in Krakow where Jan Kowalski was arrested no longer bears visible scars of occupation. The cafe where he drank ersatz coffee is now a tourist destination serving authentic Italian espresso. The cobblestones he walked on, smiling that inexplicable smile, have been walked on by millions since. The Pomorska Street building that housed the Gestapo headquarters is now a museum. The interrogation rooms preserved as memorials to suffering and resistance. In one of those rooms, perhaps room 7, perhaps another, the records are incomplete, there is a plaque. It lists names of resistance members who died in the building. Jan Kowalski's name is there, along with hundreds of others, a catalogue of the murdered. But the plaque cannot capture what happened in that room. The 17 minutes, the coded songs, the improvised, desperate, brilliant act of communication that travelled through a cleaning woman and a priest and saved 17 networks, because that is the nature of resistance under totalitarianism. It is rarely cinematic in the moment. It is not speeches or heroic last stands. It is tissue paper and invisible ink. It is a smile that means, you have not won. It is 17 minutes of apparent madness that is actually the most sane thing imaginable. The refusal to let silence be the final answer. The German soldiers who occupied Poland expected submission or violent resistance. They prepared for both. They built systems to crush both. What they didn't prepare for was the middle ground, the quiet, persistent, infinitely adaptive resistance of people who understood that survival was itself a form of victory, that every day the networks remained intact, every warning delivered, every contact saved was another small defeat for the occupation. Jan Kowalski expected to die in that cafe the moment the Gestapo burst through the door. The smile was not confidence in personal survival. It was confidence in something larger. He had been entrusted with 17 names, and he would deliver 17 warnings, even if it killed him. Especially if it killed him. Because the message was more valuable than the messenger, and the network was more important than any individual node. In the decades after the war, military historians would analyze the Polish resistance with professional admiration. The complexity of the networks, the sophistication of the codes, the ability to operate under conditions of total surveillance and violent repression. They would note that by 1944, the Polish Home Army was the largest resistance organization in occupied Europe, conducting operations that tied down German divisions, provided intelligence to the Allies, and maintained a shadow government that emerged into legitimacy the moment occupation ended. But in January 1940, none of that was assured. The resistance was fragile, learning, vulnerable. Jan Kowalski's 17 minutes mattered because they came at a moment when every connection preserved, every network saved, contributed to the possibility of survival, not just of individuals, but of the idea that Poland continued to exist as more than a geographic expression, that beneath the swastikas and the checkpoints and the Gestapo headquarters, there was still a nation waiting. The symbolic object in Jan Kowalski's story is not food or weapons or sounds. It is something more ephemeral, the human voice. The Germans controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, public assemblies. They monitored mail, tapped phones, infiltrated organizations. They built an architecture of control designed to regulate information at every level. But they could not control the voice of a dying man in an interrogation room, speaking in patterns that meant nothing to them and everything to those who knew how to listen. That voice cracked, bloody, emerging from broken lips in a building designed to extract silence, was the antithesis of everything the Nazi regime represented. The Reich was mechanical, ordered, hierarchical. Information flowed through official channels, stamped and approved and filed. Jan's voice was organic, adaptive, human. It found a cleaning woman, a priest, a network of ordinary people who chose to listen, to remember, to act. And in that contrast between the machinery of occupation and the improvised humanity of resistance lies the eternal truth about totalitarianism. It always underestimates the human capacity for communication. It always believes that if you control the obvious channels, you control the message. It never quite grasps that people are themselves channels, that meaning can be carried in songs and silences, in what is said and what is deliberately left unsaid. The epilogue of Jan Kowalski's story is not about Jan Kowalski. It is about the 17 people he saved, and the hundreds who lived because those 17 survived, and the thousands whose lives were touched by the networks that remained intact because of 17 minutes in room 7. It is about Zofia Pasternak, who lived to see the liberation of Poland in 1945, who died peacefully in 1963, and who never fully understood the significance of the information she carried from the Gestapo headquarters to the church that January evening. It is about Father Wojciech, who baptized children of resistance members, who buried the murdered, who kept faith literally and metaphorically through the darkest years of occupation. But most of all, the epilogue is about the principle that Jan embodied in his 17 minutes, that information is power, but only if it moves, that a network is only as strong as its weakest link's commitment to the whole, that individual heroism, while valuable, is less important than the system that allows heroism to matter. The Germans dragged Jan Kowalski out of a cafe in Krakow on a frozen January morning. He smiled because he knew something they didn't, that they had already lost, even if it would take 5 more years for the material reality to catch up with the spiritual truth. He dropped 17 warnings in 30 seconds of coded speech, delivered not to the Germans interrogating him, but to the city around him, through walls and windows, and the irrepressible human tendency to listen, to remember, to care. And when Klaus Richter stood over Jan's body on the 22nd of January 1940, noting the failure to extract useful intelligence, writing his report in precise German bureaucratese, filing the death as one more entry in the vast catalogue of Nazi efficiency, he was standing in the presence of a victory he couldn't see. A victory measured not in territory or armaments, but in information preserved, networks maintained, people saved. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. The Polish resistance, born in the ashes of September 1939, endured until liberation. And somewhere in the gap between those two truths is the meaning of Jan Kowalski's smile, not triumph, which would have been premature, not despair, which would have been surrender, but certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from believing in something larger than yourself, and knowing that your part in it, however small, however painful, however brief, is necessary and will not be forgotten. 17 names on tissue paper, 17 minutes of coded speech, 17 networks saved, and one smile that meant, "You have not broken us, and you never will." That is the inheritance of resistance. Not the grand gestures captured in film and monument, but the small, fierce, relentless acts of communication that keep human connections alive in the face of systems designed to sever them. Jan Kowalski died in a room designed for death, but his voice, his improvised, desperate, brilliant voice travelled through that room's walls and into the city beyond, carrying warnings that saved lives and preserved the possibility of a future he would never see. The frozen square in Krakow, the cafe with the bursting door, the smile that confused torturers, 17 minutes that changed hundreds of fates. This is not myth or propaganda. This is the documented, verifiable, extraordinary reality of resistance under occupation. This is what it meant to fight when fighting seemed impossible. This is what it meant to speak when silence was enforced. This is what it meant to smile in the face of the machinery of death, because you knew, truly knew, that the machine was not as strong as it believed itself to be. Jan Kowalski was dragged out. He smirked. Then he dropped 17 warnings in 30 seconds, through 17 minutes, through a cleaning woman, through a priest, through a network that refused to die. And the Reich that killed him is dust. while the memory of his voice echoes still, in archives and histories, and the living presence of families who exist because someone listened when a dying man sang songs in a language the Germans controlled but could never truly understand. That is the power of human connection. That is the weakness of totalitarian control. That is the story of the 17th of January 1940, in a frozen square in Krakow, where a young man smiled and everything changed, quietly, invisibly, irrevocably. The Germans counted it as one more successful arrest. History counts it differently. And the difference between those two countings is the space where freedom lives, even in occupation, even in Room 7, even in the last breaths of a man who refused to let silence be his final statement. His name was Jan Kowalski. He was 23 years old, and in 17 minutes he won a victory the Germans never saw coming and never understood, even as it unfolded in front of them, carried in the voice of a man they had already condemned but could not, finally, silence.